We are glad that you are here today to join with us during this time. So grab your Bibles, your devices. Today it's the book of Philippians, as Janet just read for us, chapter 1. Today we begin our new series together and entitled, So Glad You Asked. And what we did a few weeks ago is that we asked you to submit some questions to us. And what you saw on the bumper video this morning is a few of them, over perhaps 120 questions that you have submitted to us as well. And so we plan to actually cover 100 of them this morning. So we're glad that you're here, right? Yes. No, we will not do that. We will cover one today. So for part one, here's the first question that we want to cover this morning, and it's this: if God is so good, then why does he allow so much evil? If God is so good, then why does he allow so much evil? So I start this teaching this morning by telling you, as a disclaimer, there's a lot of things in life I don't understand. And so I want to say, for those of you that are going to take this journey with us, whether you're here on campus or joining us through church at home, and we are so glad that you're here with us as well, if you're joining us through one of our social media platforms or YouTube, that I want to say there's some things in life I just don't understand, right? And so this morning, real early, I text my two oldest sons who are fathers, and I just said, Happy Father's Day, and I said some kind words that I meant from my heart to them as well. And then my oldest son, Chadwick, who lives in Atlanta, he texted me back almost immediately, and he said, kind words from the goat, is what he said to me, right? Kind words from the goat. And I thought, dude, I just said some things about you being a great husband, a great father, and now you, on Father's Day, you call your dad a goat, right? And he kind of affectionately already calls me old man all the time, but I take it as an affectionate title from him. So he said, kind words from the goat. And I thought, I don't know what he's saying. It must be something I don't understand in culture, right? And so I looked it up, or I had to look it up, and I prayed about it, and that's not true. I Googled it is what I did, right? Yes, I Googled it before I asked God anything. And so I Googled it, and what I realized that goat simply means the greatest of all time. I didn't know that, right? So I've learned something this morning. So I trust as we embark on this journey over these next 8 weeks or so, that you open your heart and your mind, perhaps to some things that you don't understand, and you allow God to speak to you powerfully. And today, if God is so good, then why does he allow so much evil? So I have a couple of questions. If you have notes this morning, the printed version, or if you're online and you have notes today, then the first question is this: have you ever felt powerless when it comes to what is going on around you? Yes or no? Have you ever felt powerless when it simply comes to what's going on around you? The second question is this: have you ever been confused as to why God does not seem to intervene more? Have you ever been confused as to why God doesn't seem to intervene more? And the third is this: that was a yes or no question. And have you ever been angry at the evil, the pain, the violence, and the loss in the world, and you just wanted to do something about it? And that's a yes or no. And perhaps I think that most of us probably did yes for most of those questions. So I begin to think, what are we talking about? And this, in current culture, this current rash of school shootings, government corruption, abortion, human trafficking, poverty, war, disease, the pandemic, COVID, which perhaps many of us have lost friends to that as well, crime, racism, and the list goes on and on and on. So if God is so good, then where is he? Where is God if God is so good? And I think, we could take a moment to simply teach right now and be justified by saying that what we believe at Hope Fellowship, this theological concept of that we live in the already but the not yet. And what that means is this: that the redemptive work of Christ has been done on the cross, the already within our lives, we know that, but the not yet is the understanding that redemption is not fully realized until the second advent, when Christ returns. And what he says he will do, he will make all things right, and he will right all injustices in this world. And we could say that right now, and I think be justified by saying that. that we live in this world in perhaps what we call the in-between, that we're not powerless, but sin no longer has dominance over our lives, but it does tempt us and influence us. So we find ourselves in this moment of living in the in-between, not to be confused with the upside down, right? Yes, for those Stranger Things fans in here, it is a bit different than that. It is. But you're saying, but what about now, Mark? I don't want to hear those pat theological answers for all of this. What about where we're living now and what's going on in the world? And you say all those other things that you just said is kind of like a bunch of, and I tried to find a word that I could say in church, right? And I really did. So I found the word malarkey. Have you ever heard the word malarkey? Have you ever heard that before? Yes. It's perhaps not what you think it is. We tell people they're full of malarkey, and your mind goes to something else, doesn't it? Right. Yes, it does. So I looked up the word. It is a real word, and it means meaningless talk is exactly what it means. And so I think that when we look at these things and we hear the things that I just said, you think, Mark, you are full of malarkey as you are, because these are meaningless words in light of what's going on in the world, because we have these unanswered questions about God. We do. And I think regardless of how long you've been at church or how long you've been walking with Christ, regardless of any of those kinds of things, you still have these questions. So here's two of them, and I think we have to wrestle with this morning. The first is this: if God allows evil and suffering to continue, and both of these questions, I think, start with this: if God allows evil and suffering to continue because he can't stop it, then he might be good, but he is not omnipotent. He is not all-powerful. Put that up one more time. It needs to sink in for a moment. If God allows evil and suffering to continue because he can't stop it, then he might be good, but he's not all-powerful. But I think the second question is this: if God allows evil and suffering to continue, but he could stop it, and yet he won't stop it, then he might be all-powerful, he might be omnipotent, but he's not a good God. And I think that somehow in our lives, and at some point in our lives, we have formed those questions in our heart and our mind. We have struggled with those things. So what do we do with those arguments? What do we do with that? Oh, we just ignore it, have faith in God, and trust God. Mark, you are full of malarkey is what you are, right? You are. I need something more than that. Because it's not just good. I don't think it's good enough just to simply say that pat theological answer in the throes of those moments of our life, those moments when we're saying, why God? In those moments. So I think that this warrants a discussion. It does. And it reminds me of a text that we find in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. And here's what it says: but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. That we need to know why we hope. We need to have some foundation in our lives, is what he's saying, yet do it with gentleness and respect. So I can't stand up here and tell you, hey, don't ask God those questions. Stop. It's a breach of your faith for you to do that. Don't ask God those hard questions, because you don't want to try to do that with God and try to stump him. That's not what this is about. No, I want to say with gentleness and respect, these are real concerns for us. They're real concerns. And I think that we have to devote some time to this. So today is part one of two parts dealing with this question. If God is so good, then why does he allow so much evil in the world? And I can't get it all in 1 week, or you would have had to brought your lunch and maybe even early dinner. You would have, because I can't. So what do we do in those moments of our life? What do we do in those times of our life when we're struggling with this question? I'm so glad you ask. You know, that's the title of our series. Yes, because I think what we first do is we attempt to apply human reasoning to divine action is what we do. We attempt to apply human reasoning to divine action, or what we see as a lack of action with God. We try to reason with God and reason God's actions or lack of actions in this world. And so if I can't figure out God and what he's doing or what he's not doing, then this can't be God, or there can't be a God, is what some of us think. And so we separate ourselves from the things that don't line up with our human reasoning, is what we do. That's our natural response as humans. If I can't understand it, then I don't want to be attached to it, is what we say. And so here's what we do. We separate ourselves from our belief in a good and a powerful God to understand suffering and evil. I think you have to kind of sit in that thought for a moment. That we separate ourselves from a good and a loving and a powerful God to understand suffering and evil. You say, Mark, when I listen to that and I hear you say that, I'm not sure that makes a lot of sense. I know, but we find ourselves exactly there within those moments of our life. And we push back from God is what we do. So we need some help in this area. I need some help in this area. So I have two thoughts. The first is this: your questions are not unique to you. And I want you to understand that your questions this morning that you have about God and God's actions or lack of actions or the evil in the world, they're not unique questions. So for a moment, you have greeted each other. You said, Happy Father's Day. Could you turn to someone next to you and say to them, your questions are not unique? Could you say that to them? Could you say that for a moment? I didn't say to them, you are not unique. That's not what I said to you, okay? Because we all are, right? But your questions, well, what do you mean by that, Mark? It's an Old Testament narrative for a moment before we get to Philippians. It's found in the book of Judges, chapter 6, verse 13. And it's the story of Gideon. And here's what this one verse says. And Gideon said to him, Gideon is having a conversation with the angel of the Lord about the Lord himself, right? And so here's what he says. Please, my Lord, if the Lord, uppercase L, if the Lord is with us, if God is with us, why then has all this happened to us? You ever been there? If God is with me, then why does all this happen to me? And where are all his wondrous deeds that our fathers recounted to us? It is sarcasm, right? Some of you possess the spiritual gift of sarcasm, don't you, right? Yes, you do. And saying is what he said, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hand of the Midians. I love this Old Testament narrative. I wanted to share it with you today for a moment because I wanted you to understand, I believe God wants you to understand that there's really been some amazing and outstanding people through history, through biblical history, who have had the very same questions that you have right now in your life. Very same questions. So they are not unique to you. You see, the Israelites are continually find themselves subject to these pesky Midianites. And if you read the book of Judges, especially chapter 6, you realize that what happens with the Israelites is they plant their crops, they plant their gardens, it grows and becomes beautiful. And just before harvest, the Midianites come in always, and they simply take all the food from Israel. Israel is left to starve. And in fact, Judges chapter 6 refers to the Midianites as like locusts, is what it. One, because they are many of them. Two, because they come in and they destroy the land, and they take all the food and they leave nothing but dirt left behind them. It's sort of like this. It's sort of like you preparing Thanksgiving meal, my favorite holiday. 164 days from today. It is. Yes, I'm super excited about it. I can smell the turkey and the pumpkin pie already, right? And you prepare your Thanksgiving dinner. You have it already. You bring the family into the table. You get ready to carve the turkey. All of a sudden, your doorbell rings. You get up. You say, excuse me for a moment. You go to the door. You open the door. And there is a horde of Midianites in your front yard like locusts, right? Yes, yes. Now, if this is South Carolina and the story was simply played out here, then there would be some gunfire about now, right? Yes, because you're not taking our turkey and our pumpkin pie. Exactly, that's not gonna happen. But they're like locusts, there's too many. They come in, they sit at your table while your whole family watches. They eat everything, leave nothing but the bones in empty containers, and they simply leave, and they go back to Midian, and they wait for next Thanksgiving, so they're gonna show up again. That's exactly what they're talking about here. Yeah, that's it. So why does God allow continued evil? This is unjust, this is unfair. They leave filled and you leave us with nothing but bones. Is it simply what they're, where is God in all of this that he continually allows this to happen? Because I thought, if he allows this to happen and he can't stop it, then God is not all powerful. But if he can stop it, but he continues to allow it, then God is not good. God is cruel and God is punitive. That's the kind of God. So what Gideon does, as you and I do, is he applies human reasoning to try to make sense of God. Well, God is loving and God is in control, yes. I've heard all the things that God has done in the past, is what he said to the angel of the Lord. I'm measuring God by this. And so Gideon asked the Lord in this sarcastic tone, where are all his wondrous deeds that our fathers recounted? So in other words, if God did it in the past and he brought us out of Egypt, then why can't God do this now, is what he says. I've heard all the sermons. I've listened to all the podcasts. I've read all the latest books. Yet I see all the pain in the world, so where is God? And he draws a conclusion. And before you judge Gideon, I think, realize that we perhaps drawn this conclusion at some point in our life, and Gideon says, but now the Lord has forsaken us. Sometimes I think it helps us to understand that we're not the only one that feels like this. Do you know what I mean? We're not the only one that deals with these thoughts. We're not the only one that's had these questions. That we're not the only one that's ever had this moment where we said, God, maybe you have forsaken me. God, what about all the things you've done for everyone else? But God, you've not done that for me. God, you say you're loving and you're in control, but look at all the stuff that's going on in the world and all the evil that's taking place. God, where are you? So where do we start in understanding this? Where? We start, I think, by going to someone that's much smarter than we are. I always tell you this, that when we have tough theological things to understand, always find someone that's smarter than you to help you to understand that. So we go to the Apostle Paul. And what the Apostle Paul says, as Janet read this morning, Ephesians 1 and 12, he says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really, and that word really is very interesting to me, because he could have left it out and he could have said has happened to me, has served to advance the gospel. But he says, the word really is there, because what he's saying is, trust me on this, because it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to you human-wise. It really doesn't. So you got to trust me on this. He says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, is what he says. So he says, welcome to class. Pull up a chair, take some notes, because there's more here than meets the eye. And he goes on to say, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is from Christ. That he finds himself in jail, but he's saying these things about God. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold. By the word bold, you can write the word courage, to speak the word without fear. So Paul's in jail, and that brings courage, right? What? If you put human reasoning with that, it just doesn't quite come together. It really doesn't. So that's where we struggle in all of this. We need a gospel foundation that enables us to deal with suffering and evil. So where does Paul start? That's where he starts. He starts with his statement that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, is where he starts. That God uses this moment. But understand this, it is not God who put Paul in jail. Paul is there by the Romans because of him preaching the gospel. So you need to understand that and make sense of that this morning. That it's not God that placed him there, but he's there because he was preaching the gospel. And I think in this moment, it's very applicable for you and I to take a thought from the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph. When Joseph is in Egypt and he reveals himself to his brothers in the palace in Egypt, and he says to his brothers who had sold him into slavery, what you meant for good, God has chosen or what you meant for evil, right? That's the right way, right? What you meant for evil, God has meant for good in my life, is what he says. What you have meant for evil, God has meant for good. And so God does use those moments in our life, right? God uses those moments. It's not God who jailed Paul, but God does work in those moments of our life. So what I realize is this: in the face of evil and suffering, abandoning your belief in God, or your understanding of his character and nature does not help you. It does not. I'm going to read it one more time. I think that has to sit in. In the face of evil and suffering, abandoning your belief in God or your understanding of his character and nature does not help you. It does not. And we tend to do that at times in our life. Because apart from God, how do you and I even know what's evil or good? How do we even know the difference between those two things apart from God? Because dealing with evil and suffering is a struggle for whether you are a believer or an unbeliever. But what I want to say to you this morning is, if you are an unbeliever, and if you are and you're here this morning or you're watching us through church at home, then hey, we're glad that you're here. But if you are an unbeliever and you're sitting in this room, we're glad that you're here. You're in the right place. This is the place you need to be. But I want to tell you, but for you, it's more difficult in these moments. It's more difficult for those that do not believe and embrace God to simply deal with suffering in the world and violence in the world and evil in the world. It is. So I want to use an illustration that I read a few weeks ago from Tim Keller. And I want to use this illustration because I think it helps us to understand this. And then we're going to get to this foundation that we find in the book of Philippians, and then we're going to pray. But what he says, and he refers actually in this illustration to Martin Luther King Jr.'s document called A Letter from Birmingham Jail. If you've never read the document, look it up, Google it this afternoon and read it. It is inspiring. It is. And it will cause you to sit for a moment and to think about those words. But in that letter, A Letter from Birmingham Jail, that I want to quote it very loosely, the way that I think just what I've taken from Dr. King's words. And here's what he says. He says that simply, the only way that we can know if a human law is unjust is that we view that human law in light of divine law. I want to say that to you one more time. That the only way that we can know if a human law is unjust is that we view that human law in the light of divine law. So Dr. King, what he's referring to there is racial segregation, is exactly what he's referring to. In that specific letter, he's referring to that. But that concept of that philosophy, which I think is very biblical and very spiritual, I think applies to everything that we face in this world. It is. But he's specifically talking about how we value humanity, how we would value that of God's creation using human standards, and that of turning a blind eye and a deaf ear to God's standards, which that is of equality. And so he talks about that of racial segregation. But so I have the question then, so apart from God, how do we even know that things like segregation are evil? You say, Mark, you're getting real philosophical this morning on us, right? Yes. And we need something more than that. We didn't come for that today, I could listen to a podcast. No, just sit for a moment, put on your seatbelt and listen. If there was no God, no divine law, then how do we know what is evil or what is unjust? You see, here's the thought. Without God and divine law, then our view of suffering and injustice in this world is our opinion, nothing more. It is our opinion. It's a human standard, and so sometimes we say, well, I don't understand what God is doing, so I'm going to apply human reasoning to God. So God doesn't make sense in what God is doing, or the reality of maybe what I feel is an absence of God. So I'm going to separate myself from God, and somehow all of this evil and suffering is going to make more sense without God. And so God does not make sense, and without God, or without a belief in God, that leaves me with nothing but nature in this world to believe in. And if there's something I know about nature, is this, that in nature, there is this natural order of violence. There's nothing more natural in nature than violence. Just watch the Animal Channel. They eat one another, right? Isn't that true? Yes, they do. You say, Mark, wait a minute. A light just came on. I'm kind of thinking about our culture right now and what's going on, right? And so it's the natural order of selection that the strong survive. So violence is natural in nature. It is. So if all we have is nature and we have removed God from the equation, then what's wrong with violence? Because it's natural. Put on your thinking hat for a moment with me. So if we're not embracing a loving and a gracious God, then we're going to struggle with evil and suffering in the world, and that struggle is just going to be compounded upon us. People say, Mark, I hate violence, but I don't believe in God. Have you ever wondered where your hatred for violence even comes from? You have actually discounted your statement about not believing in God, is what you have actually done by simply stating a hatred for something that God hates himself. So if there was no God, or God's distant, or God is removed from our lives, then in this world everything would be permitted. And if there was no God, then you might feel that this is wrong, but that's a feeling upon your part. And if there was no God, on what basis do we have to object violence? Because it's natural in nature. So if you remove God, the point is, then dealing with the suffering and the evil of this world is even a bigger problem for you. Understand that. Separating yourself from your belief system when you can't reason with the things that God is doing, when you can't put God in your box, when you can't label God and explain the things that God is doing or what you think God is not doing, and it just doesn't make sense of all of the evil. It's a trick of the enemy. Understand it. It's always been a trick of Satan to use in my life and your life to isolate you from the only hope that you have and to simply leave you drowning in hopelessness in this world. So our human nature, our sinful nature, is when we can't understand God, when we look at all the evil and the pain and the violence and the things of this world, that we separate ourselves from that, from the very one that gives us the definition of what is unjust and what is violent and what is evil in this world. And we separate ourselves from him. And what happens is that the enemy isolates us from our only hope. And I notice some of you are there, whether you're in this room or you're watching us at home, sitting in your living room or wherever in your phone today, and you're there and you say, God doesn't make sense, so I'm going to remove myself from God is what I'm going to do. I'm going to separate myself from him because I can't explain him. And maybe I can understand things in this world more and have a better grip on that if I lose sight of God. I remove myself from him. And the reality is, it is only God that helps you to understand even what is evil in this life. And that's a lot to take in and digest. That's why there has to be part two. You understand now, right? It makes sense. It does. Yes. So you and I need a firm foundation to stand on. This is where we come to Philippians. More than we need an answer to a question, I think what you need, we need a foundation. I think sometimes we can have questions answered in our life, but it's not foundational. More than the answer to all the questions, we need a foundation. And this is where Paul starts in his letter with a foundation, not just an exhaustive answer of why the evil and the suffering has befell him in this life. It's more than that, because it's more than just an answer. It's a person and an event. It's the gospel is what it is. That's why he starts out this letter saying, hey, I'm in jail, but why I'm in jail, it has to do with the gospel, because that's the foundation. It's the way that Paul finds joy and peace in the middle of chains in his life, because he finds himself refocused in life, not on those things, but on the gospel is what he does. What has happened to me has served to advance the gospel. It's not just the mission. It's not just what God has called him to. The message of the gospel is what it is where he finds joy. It builds his character. It strengthens him. It simply helps him in life. It is more than just an answer. So I wrote this week in my journal. And I know that there's a lot of things each week that I say over and over and over. And I say them for a purpose. I really do. It's not because of my age, okay, like the dead thing was this morning, right? But yet I say these. One of those things is, so glad you asked. That's the ask, and that's the sermon, the series title. But the other thing is, I wrote in my journal because I want you to learn to write. I want you to learn to journal those things as God speaks into your heart. And so I wrote this week, enlightenment. And I use that word because I think some of you are seeking that with God today, an understanding of God and what God is doing and what God is not. And enlightenment regarding evil and suffering is experienced at the cross and not having all of your questions answered. It is. That how I understand evil and how I understand suffering in this world is answered when I stand before the cross. It's not just me having every question in my life answered. So what does that mean? And I share this with you before we leave. It's the book of Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. And here's what the writer of Hebrews says. He says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. Christ understands every thought you have. Every thought. And I think that we always say Christ hears every thought that you have, but I wanted us to use the word understand in a very intentional way, because he understands every thought that you have. But one who is in every respect has been tempted as you are, yet without sin. So what does this have to do with me and all the evil in the world and why God allows all those things? What does that have? Because what I realize is this. When I stand before the cross, the gospel, that God so lovingly looked down upon humanity and saw our brokenness, and in his great love and compassion for you and I, wraps God in flesh in that of the incarnate Christ, and he comes and he lives and he dies and he's buried. On the third day he rose again and he ascends to the Father, and he's there to intercede for you and I. So the gospel. But when I stand before the cross, what I realize is the cross does not answer the question of why God allows so much evil to continue in the world, but it does tell me what the answer is not. And sometimes in life, just knowing what the answer is not is what I need. And the answer is not because he doesn't love us. And the answer is not because he doesn't care. And the answer is not because he's not present in our lives. Because just the cross itself dispels all of those ideas. The gospel removes all of that thinking. The gospel overshadows all the questions that you and I might have in this life that we can't simply find that specific answer for. So God says, let me tell you what the answer is not. It's not that I don't love you. It's not that I'm not present in your life. It's not that I don't care. Because the cross dispels all of those thoughts. Hebrews chapter 4 says that he suffered every thought, not just every action, but every thought that you've ever had. Every thought. Every thought about violence and injustice in the world, Christ suffered through that as you do. Think about that. He was executed unjustly. If you've ever experienced injustice in this world, and if you've ever seen injustice in this world, think about this, that Christ was executed unjustly. He committed no crimes, yet he suffered the death of a criminal, so that in the moments when you see injustice, or in the moments when you are treated unjustly, Christ experienced that for you. Understand that. He cried out to God, Father, let this cup pass from me. Why did he do that? Because he felt the weight of your sin on his life, yes, but I think even more than that, he cried out because he knew there would be times when you would cry out to God and ask God why. So he cries out for you. He cries out in pain on the cross. Why? Because yes, he suffered physical pain, but he cries out in pain for the moments when you are in pain in this life, whether it's a physical pain or an emotional pain or whatever it is within your life, then it is a pain that you have. So he cried out because he knew that you would experience those things. So I may not can tell you all the reasons today why God does allow evil and suffering to continue in the world, but yet what I can say to you is I can tell you what it's not. And it's not because he doesn't love you or care for you or have experienced the things that you have experienced in life, because he has and he does. And that's enough foundation for my life. That's enough. For you, for me. So where are you? You have the questions, right? You're struggling with those moments in your life. You're looking for that specific, detailed answer. And what God has said to you this morning is take a moment, step back, and stand before the cross. Stand before the cross. Because the foundation for your life is not the answer for every question. The foundation of your life is the gospel and what Christ has done for you. It's not an answer per se in a word form, but it's a person and an event, and that of Christ and the cross for you. You say, Mark, you've just escaped the question, is all you've done. No, be here next week for part 2. But I think where you are today starts here. How can we talk about anything else if you don't have the foundation? So for a moment, can I pray with you? If you take a posture of prayer, whether it's bowing your heads, closing your eyes, or whatever you feel comfortable just sitting there for a moment, could I pray with you and pray for you this morning right now? Those of you that are joining us through Church at Home, could you pray with us as well? Father, thank you for speaking to us this morning. Father, thank you for opening our hearts and minds to where we begin this journey. Because God, if the focus is on an answer for a question and not on you and your work within our lives, then God, that answers nothing really for us. So God, this journey today begins with the foundation. So Lord, let this day, this moment be foundational for our lives. Let this moment, as we stand before the cross with all of our questions about why, God, and why you allow this, and why has this happened to me, and God, and we look back like Gideon, and we say, but God, you've done all these things in the past, and we know what our forefathers have said about you, but Lord, it doesn't seem to be working that way in our life, and we try to apply human reason to you. God, let us stand before the cross, which gives us a firm foundation. Father, for those in the room, for those that are joining through Church at Home, who say God is so cruel and evil, they say that about you, Lord, and that you're big enough to handle that, God. I know that. And God, because of that, they say that you don't exist or they withdraw from you. God made this question of how can we even know the difference between good and evil without understanding you and understanding those definitions come from you. How can we say that you don't even exist, Lord? And God, let that be a moment, a seed in their heart and their mind to open up to you today, Lord. So, Father, let us sit in this today and absorb what you're saying to us. And may it change us. Build a foundation through the gospel that you sent your Son to die for us when we were absolutely unworthy and we brought nothing to the table but brokenness. And he came and he died for us because you love us, Father. And in that we rejoice today. Because you are good and you are all powerful and you are all present in our life. In your name we pray.